This lesson is about remembering to do stuff. As my wife can tell you, I sometimes forget to do things that I'm supposed to do. I'm not unique in that respect. That's a characteristic of human beings. But when we're flying an airplane, forgetting to do something can have a lot more serious consequences than forgetting to fold the laundry. Effective use of checklists is a powerful tool to avoid forgetting to do stuff. Early pilots didn't use checklists. Like many aviation practices, the use of checklists came about because of a tragedy. A B-17 prototype crashed after takeoff because the crew forgot to unlock the rudder and the elevator controls. The investigators that investigated this accident noticed that aircraft like the B-17 had gotten a lot more complex than earlier aircraft, and it had become difficult for pilots to remember to do everything they needed to do. Their recommendation to the Air Force was to institute the use of checklists. The Air Force did that, and it was very successful. So based on the success in the Air Force, the use of checklists has been adopted throughout aviation for aircraft much simpler than a B-17, and it has saved a lot of pilots from forgetting important things. So you should view use of checklists not just as something that you need to do to satisfy your instructor and because your examiner is going to expect to see you doing it. Instead, I encourage you to make really effective use of your checklist. To do that, I want to start by talking about the difference between a checklist and a to-do list. Then I want to talk about when you should perform checklists, what items should be on each checklist, and then some of the different sources and formats of checklists that are available. So a to-do list is used when you are doing a set of tasks. Basically, you use it like a set of instructions. You read one item, then you do that task, then you read the next item, etc. If you accidentally skip an item while you're using a checklist in that way, it's very likely that that task doesn't get done at all. A checklist is different than a to-do list. You use a checklist after you should have done all of the tasks on the list. So first you do the tasks either from memory or using a flow pattern, and the checklist provides redundancy. So what I mean by a flow pattern is a pattern of searching across the instruments, the switches, the controls in the cockpit in kind of a systematic pattern. And as you go past each instrument or control, thinking about, does that item need to be changed or it's reconfigured in some way? So if you forget to do something when you're doing your flow pattern, then you're likely to notice the oversight when you do the check using the checklist. If you miss something accidentally while you're doing your checklist, it's pretty likely that you actually had already remembered it anyway when you were doing the flow. So unless you make two errors, the task in question does get done and nothing bad happens. Checklists are typically used before or after any transition, and they're best to use them during a time that's relatively less busy. You don't want to use them in the middle of a takeoff, roll, or landing. Examples that are common: your pre-flight inspection, your passenger briefing, before and after starting the engine, after the run-up, before and after the takeoff, whenever you start a climb, whenever you enter cruise, whenever you start a descent, before and after the landing, and finally, before you walk away from the aircraft after the end of the flight. Some of these, like the after takeoff checklist, is actually more of an after leaving the traffic pattern checklist, and the before landing checklist should be a before entering the traffic pattern checklist, so that it doesn't happen during a really busy time in flight. For simpler aircraft, which are common when you're doing training, some of those occasions may not really have enough reconfiguring of the aircraft that they justify having a separate checklist for that. You may also find checklists for unusual situations, such as if you have a gear extension failure, an electrical system failure, something like that. For each of the occasions that you should use a checklist, as mentioned on the previous slide, you should have a separate checklist. So what items should be on each of those checklists? Each checklist should include tasks that you should have done by the point that you're using the checklist, and where forgetting to do them will have some bad effect later. So a good example, in a retractable gear airplane, you would lower the landing gear prior to doing the pre-landing checklist, and it would obviously have bad effects if you forgot it. So that's a obvious item that you would want to have on your pre-landing checklist. I've seen a lot of pre-landing checklists that include lowering the flaps. I don't put that on my pre-landing checklist because the way I operate my aircraft, I do the pre-landing checklist before entering the traffic pattern, but I don't lower the flaps until I'm in the traffic pattern. So it wouldn't be a thing that I can check that I've done at that point. In addition to tasks where you need to do something, you should include items for things that need to be checked. For example, checking the oil pressure in the after engine start checklist. You don't need to do something to make sure that the oil pressure is what it's supposed to be. You just need to check that the oil pressure responded like it was supposed to, because you would need to do something if it didn't. I don't like to include things on checklists unless they are forgettable in some sense. I've seen landing checklists that include the item land. I think that's kind of silly. I've never known anybody to forget to land. Similarly, I've seen engine starting checklists that list engaging the starter. I've never known anybody forget to do that step when they're trying to start the engine. I think the reason that does get included sometimes is because people are using it as a to-do list, and the item is on there just to separate the things that they should do before starting from the things that they should be doing after engine starting. But it would be better to have a pre-engine start checklist and a post-engine start checklist, and you know that you engage the starter in between those two. Sometimes there's two items that really need to be done in a particular sequence. When that's the case, I'd like to see them be on separate checklists where you do a checklist between the two where you check the first item. One example, in my aircraft, in order to check the oil, I need to turn the propeller through a number of times. But I don't want to turn the propeller through with the ignition on, because there'd be a risk of starting the engine. So I have a cabin pre-flight checklist that includes the item checking to make sure that the ignition is off, and then an engine pre-flight checklist that includes starting the oil. And I do the cabin pre-flight checklist before I start doing any of the engine pre-flight tasks. When you take your check ride, the examiner is going to expect you to use a checklist. But the certification standards do not specify that it has to be the checklist that's been provided by the airplane manufacturer. There are alternatives to using the factory-provided checklist. You can make your own checklist. A custom checklist has some advantages and some disadvantages compared to the factory-provided checklist. So one of the most obvious advantages of the factory-provided checklist is that it already exists. You don't need to do anything to create it. Second advantage is that it will be familiar to your flight instructor. Probably the first flight lesson that you're using that airplane, the instructor will pull a checklist out of a pocket in the airplane and hand it to you and say, this is the checklist for this airplane. That's the final advantage is that it is airplane model specific. So if there are unique things about that airplane model, unique tasks that need to be done at a particular time or checked at a particular time, the checklist provided by the factory will reflect those airplane model specific features. There are also some disadvantages of the factory provided checklist. One thing, a lot of the training aircraft may have been built 40, 50 years ago, and they've had modifications since they left the factory. A lot of those modifications may influence what tasks need to get done by the pilot at different points in time, and those tasks might not have been added to the checklist when the modification was done. Also, the checklists sometimes include items related to options that you don't have. For example, my aircraft has an optional autopilot, but my aircraft doesn't have that. I didn't choose that. So the factory provided checklist for my aircraft have a lot of items about setting the autopilot, but I don't even have one. And then what I consider probably the biggest problem with the factory provided checklist, a lot of them are written as to-do lists. And it's actually kind of difficult to use them as a checklist instead of a to-do list. And I recommend using them as checklists. If you fly a particular aircraft frequently, whether it's your training aircraft or after you're licensed and you move into other aircraft where you're flying, you either own one or fly the same one frequently, I strongly recommend that you consider making your own custom checklist for that aircraft. You'll see checklists in a variety of different formats, and different formats have various pros and cons. One of the most common is laminated sheets, especially for factory provided aircraft or factory provided checklists. They're relatively convenient and durable. The writing tends to be a little small, a little bit harder to read. But the biggest problem I've had with laminated sheets is if you want to make an update to the checklist, that's relatively hard to do. Various electronic apps like ForeFlight have a feature to put checklists in them and modify those checklists and then go through the checklist while you're flying. These are pretty convenient. It's easy to modify the checklist, which is a real advantage. One disadvantage I've found with checklists this way is that you usually have to switch screens from the one that you were previously using. So you may be, you don't have your moving map display while you're doing your checklist. Sometimes a checklist is fastened to the instrument panel, or like in this picture, fastened to the yoke. That's really useful to do with certain checklists that happen to be done during very high workload phases of flight. A before landing checklist or after takeoff checklist are good examples of checklists that you tend to be real busy at that time, so it's nice not to have to find the appropriate checklist amongst others and fumble around with it at that time. You just have it written right on your instrument panel somewhere. But due to the space required, usually you can only do that with certain of your checklists. So the format that I've adopted, I found it works best for me, is I bought name tag holders from Amazon, and I print out each checklist on a little piece of paper that's the right size to fit in the name tag holder. Got a batch of them connected by a keyring thing, one for each checklist. Whenever I want to make an update to them, I just change the file on the computer, print it out, and cut that one out, and put in a new piece of paper. It's really easy to update them. I found in flight the easiest way to manage them is to have my checklist attached to a lanyard that hangs around my neck. That puts they're always close at hand that way. They're not in a pocket or getting lost somewhere. When you're using checklists, especially in flight, it's much better if they are in a form where you can hold the checklist up at eye level while you're going through the items, rather than needing to look down into your lap to go through the checklist. Because if you're looking up and down from your lap while you're doing the checklist, that takes your attention more away from from looking outside, and can lead to you starting to feel airsick. To wrap up this lesson, there's a few things I hope you'll talk to your flight instructor about to ensure that you're making effective use of checklists. First, what checklist does your instructor recommend for the airplane you're trained in? And why do they recommend that checklist? Are you using your checklist as to-do lists, or are you using checklist as a second check after doing items using a flow pattern? Finally, what things would you add to or remove from the checklist that's been provided to you?